We have a list of questions, and we thought we would just kind of start asking you, and I'm sure you guys will have your own thoughts.
Melissa and I are authors, urban mobility advocates, social media influencers, I hate that word, and professionals living in the Netherlands, specifically in Delft. Myself working for an organization called the Dutch Cycling Embassy, and Melissa for Mobicon.
Yeah, so I work there as a communications and engagement advisor, but my focus is largely international markets. Being not Dutch, I don't get to work in the Netherlands too often, language requirements being what they are. But I get to focus a lot on equity and inclusion and engagement, which is really exciting. And then Chris gets to be the person that's liaising with organizations like yourself, like municipalities internationally, and finding those bridges with Dutch organizations like the one I work for.
You know my job better than I do.
What are the important ingredients you have seen in cities that are making good changes for cyclists?
That's a very big question.
Someone should write a book about that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, at least in our experience, coming from Vancouver, even a lot of it starts with the political leadership that usually comes from strong advocacy as where it starts from, pushing for that change. But oftentimes without those leaders in positions of influence, whether that's elected officials or people leading local municipal teams, it's hard to get those changes to happen. So I think that's the first big ingredient, but it seems like an impossible ingredient for some places. So I think from there, it's just understanding the importance of not just looking solely at infrastructure, but looking at the whole city. Where do people want to get to? How do they want to move? And what is the quality of that space? And then is it then, changing it through infrastructure, or are there small, softer changes that we can make to help encourage behavior change? Like I said, it's a big question, but maybe, Chris, you have additional ingredients.
Well, I think to take the 60,000-foot view, Melissa and I spend a lot of time, personally and professionally, talking about networks and the importance of network-based thinking. We've built networks for cars for decades, and it's easy, possible, comfortable, convenient to drive from A to B virtually from anywhere to everywhere in your city. We seldom talk about cycling networks in our day-to-day lives. We're so focused on individual lanes and complete streets that we miss the bigger picture. And that's this idea of thinking of the city as a series of origins and destinations, and making sure that we're building a minimum grid of cycle routes, not just one, two, but dozens and dozens of them, to make it possible to cycle from anywhere to everywhere within the city. And so I think it's one thing that Dutch cities have done remarkably well, and that we now have the privilege of exporting and teaching, is looking at your car network, your bike network, your public transportation network, your freight and service network, your emergency vehicle network.
Your walking network, of course. Untangling all of those networks and making sure you're mindful that every street cannot be everything to every mode of transportation, and that we have to untangle the various modes and think more comprehensively and holistically. And once we get those cycling networks on the ground, we've seen examples in Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, other North American cities. That's when you see the ridership really grow, the diversity of people really explode. And that's when you see the momentum really starting to build. But getting to that point, as Melissa's hinted, politically, bucking the status quo and creating that change and reaching that tipping point is really the hardest part of the equation.
How do you win over the car-centric residents into believing that cycling is a viable transportation option, even for others if they don't want to do it?
Well, I think first it's about busting the myth that most seemingly car-centric people aren't a little bit interested in what cycling can offer. I think back to earlier days in Vancouver and forcing some of my friends to come on cycle rides with me, who lived in the suburbs and drove into the city every day and were likely never to change that pattern because it's what made the most sense for them. It was the most convenient. But experiencing the city a little bit differently, it wasn't going to change their habits on a permanent basis, but it did make them think, oh yeah, that's why you want to put a bike lane there, because this is super uncomfortable to cycle next to you. Or, talking to parents and looking at, how we do school travel and, getting them to think a little bit differently. If they can think outside of their own personal experience to what it might be like for other people, you can start to not change necessarily their behavior, but at least build some empathy, which we think often starts, well, we believe often starts with not making them feel guilty or like they're on the wrong side of history, because that doesn't help anyone. We've learned in various cultural aspects in our current society that pitting people up against each other is not going to win anyone over. But yeah, I think it's having meaningful dialogue, but not going into it with conflict, understanding there are some people we're never going to win over. And those aren't the people we need to talk to. We need to be talking to the people that maybe don't fully understand why you choose to cycle everywhere and why you're asking for what you do. And then just having a good conversation of thinking, okay, think about this if you're walking. What would make this experience better for you? Well, these are very similar in terms of how we get around by bike as well.
I mean, I think it's important to understand and address where those people are coming from. We get these comments on our Facebook page in particular all the time, this irrational and emotional pushback to this idea that we should be building cycling infrastructure. And it usually comes from a place of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, a misguided belief that we want to ban all cars and get everybody on bicycles and remove the fire trucks and ambulances and go back to the 19th century. And of course, it's not true. And it's much more nuanced than that. It's not black, white, bikes versus cars. It's this beautiful nuanced gray area where we can start framing this as a win-win situation. And I think that's always our key message, is it's not taking space away from cars to benefit and advantage bicycles. It's replacing these short, unnecessary car journeys in our neighborhood with more space-efficient modes, freeing up precious road space for people who still want to drive. And so the conditions in this cycling paradise that we live in for driving are pretty awesome. There's very little traffic congestion. The cars flow freely because there is so many local journeys being made on bikes. So if we can reframe this as not a win-lose, but a win-win, and find those commonalities and that common ground, I think we can go a long way to bringing people along. But as Melissa emphasized, you're not going to get 100% of your city on board, but we should be getting those people in the middle and bringing them along to our journey of creating better cities, because it's not just necessarily about the bike.
Mm-hmm.
Would you focus more on the infrastructure that works for people who already cycle, or better infrastructure that helps those who don't cycle yet?
Yeah, that's a softball question if I've ever heard one. Yeah, I mean, all of the work that we do is not for the people already cycling. Of course, it's important to give them dignity, safety, comfort that they deserve just to use their own streets. But the potential here, the change, the transformational change that we're talking about, is we're building infrastructure for people who don't exist yet. We're building bridges for people that wouldn't swim across a river, but they would cross if the infrastructure was in place to allow them to do so. So, and with focus on certain demographics, of course, people who don't necessarily have the physical or financial means to drive a car, who are excluded from a car-based transportation system, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, disproportionately women, and making sure that we make our streets more inclusive for people who would like to move around freely and independently. So it's not necessarily about those people cycling, and that's our message when we're talking to cycling advocates is, you're already cycling, so great, that's awesome. And we're not going to convince other people to join us until we change the infrastructure on the street and start building those networks that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, Chris mentioned, the groups that don't have access to a car-based network. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about transportation in general, we're so focused on this demographic between 18 and 65. Those are the people that we automatically think of, whether we mean to or not. And that's on both sides. People that are arguing against cycling infrastructure and people cycling for, forget that when up until the age of 16, children cannot legally drive. And so they're reliant on their parents. And what we're, so many of us are advocating for is really to give our children back that freedom that, 2-3 generations ago was just normal. And now is, such a nominal experience for a lot of kids to be able to walk out of their front door and walk to school or cycle to school. And similarly, I know that a lot of us drive well past the age that we should. But again, we're essentially future-proofing our cities so that when we are too old to drive a car, we can walk and cycle comfortably depending on our own abilities. Or if we have limited abilities, using mobility scooters or using rolling walkers or any other sort of mobility aid to get around. That's all we're doing, is we're future-proofing our cities for ourselves and for the next generation of kids.
So what do you think should be the most important goals for a cycling advocacy group such as London Cycling, like ours?
Cycling is largely for young to middle-aged white people, largely, who are visibly able-bodied. And I think if we find those alliances with organizations that are working with people of color, that are working with Indigenous groups, that are working with kids groups, or working with groups for disabled people, we can start to find common ground and start having stronger messaging about how this is not just about getting on a 2-wheeled or a 3-wheeled machine, but also about making a more equitable space for how we all move. And I think it's a growing message that a lot of advocacy organizations that I've spoken to or witnessed are taking into account, is how do we bring more people into this conversation so it's not just seen as we're all very passionate about cycling, but nothing else. It's broadening that base and strengthening that voice, I think is a good place to move to.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. The only other thing I would say is, Melissa was talking earlier about the importance of political leadership is identifying your champions within your city, finding a councillor, a mayor, a head of your Department of Transport that's engaged on this topic and enthusiastic about this topic, and give them the tools, the support that they need to make it happen. I think we've seen time and time again, as soon as you are removing car space for either travel lanes or on-street parking, the proverbial mess hits the fan, and the media, the business community, the larger community will enrage and engage themselves. And that champion needs to understand that that anger is probably only a minority. It's not largely necessarily representative of the larger city. And they need to understand that it will pass. The controversy will pass. And again, we saw this exactly in Vancouver. We got involved in cycling advocacy to provide that positive side of the story that the media wasn't sharing. Friends and acquaintances that started cycling as a result of the infrastructure, businesses that were profiting from the infrastructure. And within 10 years, the argument was done. And we had reached a tipping point where the Downtown Vancouver Business Association came out against bike lanes at the beginning and did a complete 180 10 years later and started supporting bike lanes. It does take time. That controversy is inevitable. It's part of the growing pains, but you do need a political leader that will see it out and not step back from the edge or water down their proposals or give up partway through because the going got tough. And that's, I think, your role as advocates, is to help them understand that process and give them the support they need to get through that process.
I think there's one final thing, and it's funny, I've been having this conversation with a few people I've been meeting with lately, is just understanding that change takes time. We're changing human behavior in a lot of ways, changing our culture in a lot of ways, and that's not going to happen overnight. So yeah, like Chris said, being patient and being there to support those leaders, to understand in time it will come. And right now it's hard, but it gets easier.
That all makes so much sense. On with the next one, because this may have sway over people and politicians, but some people swear by quantifiable data and some really value the power of a story. Where do you land on this, and what have you seen as being successful to change minds?
I think it's a healthy balance of both. It's a nuanced answer, but I think it's having the right kind of data. I think we rely a lot on some very high-level numbers to help convince people, but until we sort of dig down and use maybe some qualitative data collection methods, which is a bit of a combination, to dig down into more the why people aren't cycling, what will convince them to get on a bike, or what will make them at least accepting of these proposed changes, even if they're not going to get on a bike. But relying solely on numbers is not enough to change that cultural aspect of our cities. We need storytellers. We need to know who the people are that are doing this and humanize this, because that's the problem with numbers. They are just numbers and they don't have a face. And so I think, yeah, it's a healthy balance, but getting the right kind of data as well. And
knowing who your audience is and adjusting the message accordingly, right? Mm-hmm. I think if you're in a meeting with elected officials, then they may be more interested in facts, figures, and numbers. If you're talking to a broader audience in the general public, one of the quotes that we often, or ideas that we often repeat, is that bringing facts to a culture war is like bringing a knife to a gunfight, that people's opinions are not going to necessarily be swayed by these facts and figures. Our mantra at Modacity when we first started was share the stories, not the statistics, because we knew that people need to be appealed to at an emotional level. They need to know how they're benefiting from this change, and give them the stories, the feel-good stories, again, of kids that are cycling, of elderly people that are cycling. We can use the same tools that the automobile industry uses, marketing a lifestyle rather than a product, and show people the freedom that cycling brings. And Melissa and I always say that at least we're telling the truth, unlike the car industry.
That is all very fair. Our city has been making piecemeal improvements scattered around the city as part of larger infrastructure projects, but there's really no connected grid. How would you convince the city to go in on a trial grid like what was done in Calgary?
How? Yeah.
A little bit of a loaded question.
We've got, I think, enough examples of not just in Europe now, but in North America that show that the true gains to ridership, to reduced congestion, to improved safety and livability only happen at the network level, that you get this amplifying exponential effect once you connect these routes in a minimum grid, as you referred to. So yeah, if they can do it in Oil Town in the Canadian prairies, and induce, 1.8 million cycle trips over the 18-month period just by reallocating 2% of the road space. And Seville in Spain did a similar experiment where they dropped a minimum grid on their streets, and the cycling numbers went up 30 or 40% overnight. Rather than pulling off the proverbial Band-Aid and making this happen over 10 years, as Vancouver did, to their detriment, perhaps, Calgary came along after watching Vancouver struggle for 10 years and said, oh, we're going to do it in
2 years.
2 years. And so I think there's a lot to be said about moving quickly, but it has to be done in an intelligent way, a strategic way, and a holistic way.
I think there's good examples to be taken, from the pandemic. I think oftentimes we're talking about network planning, it's a budgetary constraint. We've built all this infrastructure, but now we don't have any money left. And if you look to a city like Berlin that put in a bunch of temporary pop-up networks to help people get to work during the pandemic who were not going to be using public transportation. You saw it in Italy as well. Paris sort of started building temporary that has become permanent quite quickly. But these are all, fairly low-cost ways of making those connections in the gaps to at least trial it. And that's where Calgary, is the perfect example, because they trial it and then they adjust it if it's not working. And having that temporary sort of demonstration shows that it's worthwhile, but also that if it's not permanent, it can be adjusted. So it becomes the proof that people need to make it permanent later and to allocate budgets accordingly.
But I guess to come back to the original question, how you convince people to make it happen, I think the answer is really different for every single city. What is the larger theme and the discussion happening in London where cycling is the answer? In Calgary, it was their city centre was hollowing out after all the oil companies left the city centre, and the cycle network was seen as improving the attractiveness and the livability of the city centre. So what are those big topics is London aiming to be more equitable, more sustainable, more affordable? Again, cycling is the policy tool to help make that happen, but it's really up to you. What are the broader themes that you want to tie into those aspirations of what London wants to be at 10, 20, 50 years from now, and how potentially more people cycling can help make that happen?
It's tough because there's no one answer for all of those cities. So as you said, we got to figure out what our answer is. So what is the mindset we should strive for as advocates to help us succeed and persist? Because sometimes it's a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I'm actually working with an organization focused on women in mobility. And we've had the same discussion. We've been talking about feminism for how long now? And a lot of us are very tired. But I think it's again, what I said earlier is understanding that all of this change is slow. And I think it was Katrina Zimmerman when we interviewed her for the second book, who said, when we look at bike lanes and the opponents to it see only one person using it, it's deemed a failure. But it was actually, we need to look at that, flip it and look at it as a win. Like that one person was not there before. And so understanding that even if that change is incremental, even if what we're doing and the fights we keep having and the conversations we have to repeat over and over and over again are only making these small changes, you are actually improving the quality of life for one person, for a handful of individuals. And that has a domino effect that over time will benefit everybody. Yeah, we need, like in anything, we're at any advocacy group, we need voices that are passionate, that are willing to, repeat the same messages over and over again, because there's always somebody who hasn't heard it. There's always somebody that needs to hear it to feel empowered themselves, and just find those allies within each other and find those moments of strength to keep pushing, have those cathartic moments as well to just say, oh, this was just so frustrating. And I was talking to this person and they made this stupid argument again. Just to know that you've got your allies, but also that, we're all here to support each other. And, if you need to tag out, there's always somebody behind you that can tag back in, take your place until you get your energy back.
I don't think I have anything to add to that, except just to reiterate, to celebrate the importance of celebrating your successes. I think because this task is so overwhelming and we have a tendency when we get a win to just move on to the next challenge and start chipping away at the next problem. There's a lot to be said about just taking a moment, acknowledging what you've achieved and, tooling for the next fight instead of just going from battle to battle to battle, because that leads to burnout, that leads to fatigue, that leads to giving up, I think prematurely. We do need to remind ourselves that we're human, that we're not single-handedly going to fix everything, and that we can, if we support each other and help each other get away, the task can be quite overwhelming, but we can do it all together.
Okay, so what are things that make you hopeful about positive changes in North American cities? So you were talking about positives. Let's celebrate.
I need a moment to think about that one. No, if we weren't optimistic, if we weren't convinced that this is possible, then we wouldn't get up in the morning. we wouldn't do the jobs that we do. And I think that's one of the amazing privileges of working for the organizations that we do, is that every day we sit down with likely cities like your Vancouvers and your Seattles and your New Yorks, but unlikely places like Austin, Texas, and Sarnia, Ontario, and some other unlikely candidates. And in every city, again, this change is sparked by a champion that saw something on social media, who took a trip to the Netherlands or Denmark, who have a better vision for their community and want to create change. And under those circumstances, change is, of course, totally possible. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It doesn't take a lot of time necessarily. It just requires some imagination and some courage and some vision. So, I talk endlessly about Austin because the Dutch Cycling Embassy's worked there for 10 years. And in this kind of sprawling Sunbelt Southern American city, we've managed to help them build over 350 kilometers of red-tinted, Dutch-inspired cycleways. And if you can do it in the heart of Texas, you can do it anywhere. It just, again, comes down to those ingredients. They don't have any other special sauce, but they've set a standard of the cycling infrastructure they want to build and a goal to make themselves more affordable, livable, equitable, and sustainable. And they've really kind of quietly under the radar created this template of importing best practice from the Netherlands into a pretty car-dominated environment. So it's examples like that, I think, that keep us going. And if it is possible in a place like Austin, then why not anywhere else?
I think for a more local context for me, I think what's been, really, a very big positive is, we grew up in Kitchener, and I wouldn't say Kitchener's necessarily making strides, but, seeing the work coming out of Waterloo, even if it is piecemeal, there seems to be proactivity there that when we were growing up there in the 90s would be unimaginable. And also having lived in Guelph before we moved out west, these little pockets of what would be considered suburbia, which a lot of people may consider London as well, making these investments and showing this, maybe not determined or really expansive commitment, but understanding this is part of the conversation, even in very conservative places. And I think that's going forward, the positive that I see is that places, like Chris said, these unlikely suspects that are recognizing that just car-dominated space is not sustainable. You know, we have a lot of growth in a lot of places in North America. A lot of small towns are experiencing quick growth because of the expansion of our city centers and jobs moving elsewhere or remote working increasing. And, you know, places like those recognizing, okay, long-term strategy, we need to build active transportation into that, and cycling is a part of that. I think the next, 10, 15, 20 years are going to be times of real positive change in a lot of North American cities. And so I think that's been surprising, but it's nice to watch, even if we are watching it from over here. But it's nice to know when we go home to visit family that, these are things that we get to look forward to when we take trips back to KW or visit friends in London, for example. So, yeah.
So how do we get our city to engage with MotoCity or MobiCon or the Dutch Cycling Embassy?
Very easily. You just send us an email. I think, for Modacity's part, we get emails all the time from advocacy organizations, from people working at city level that are interested in having us provide a talk. And that's what we do, is we come in and we try to provide the inspiration for the why and a little bit of the how, or the what anyway. And then from there, that spurs the conversations that lead to MobiCon as a consultancy or the DCE to connect with other experts within the network of Dutch experts. But it's follow along. And if something sparks the interest, reach out via email, social media. That's pretty much it. So
it's dutchcycling.nl is our website, mobicon.com.
Yep.
Their website, and we're also all over the social media channels if people want to follow along the work we're doing and learn more about these ideas and principles. We could start by giving them a copy of one of our books. I mean, we've heard that that's helpful because there are chapters around the work that the Dutch Cycling Embassy and Melissa and I have done. And maybe just an email introduction, a virtual exchange to start. When we work with cities, it's different for every city. And sometimes it's, bringing it, regardless, it's bringing Dutch experts to the table. But it could take the form of a webinar, a virtual exchange. We do a lot of workshops internationally. We're also hosting study visits where we're bringing groups of decision makers to the Netherlands. So I think it's just figuring out maybe where the appetite is and where the barriers are, and then trying to come up with a strategy that where we can potentially help our respective organizations. Yeah,
I think it's you don't know what you don't know. And it's often, unless you introduce someone to a video that you saw or to, like Chris said, to our books, or following a social media account from some an unlikely suspect somewhere, just to spark that interest. And to help them think a little bit differently, because we're all in our bubbles, right? This is part of the problem with cycling advocacy, with any kind of advocacy, is we're often preaching. I mean, right now we're literally preaching to our people, but it's just trying to get out of that where you can, or expose somebody to something new that maybe makes them think a bit differently, and then we're there to put the pieces together and try to broaden that message to turn into actual physical action.
Really, this is the final catch-all question, are there any other pieces of advice that you'd like to give to the cycling advocates here in London?
I would just reiterate, find the themes, the topics that work for your city, and talk about how mobility can address those. It's not about the bike, it's not about the car, it's not about the tram, train, or bus. It's about livability and making everyone's lives better, whether they get on a bike or not. And I think if we can, let me get on my soapbox for a minute. Just stop engaging with the bad faith arguments. I think that's one thing that we learn very quickly as advocates, is there's people you're never going to convince and aren't interested in actually having a good faith discussion or debate. They're just there to talk about weather or hills or culture or all the reasons you can't ride a bike with 4 children to hockey practice in January. And there's no point in trying to convince those people. You're never going to convince those people. But if you can articulate a positive, inclusive vision for your city and how transportation and mobility helps accomplish that, then I think you might attract more bees with honey, so to speak, when you think and talk big picture and don't get stuck in the trenches arguing about helmets and high-vis and all those silly little distractions. That would be my closing thought.
The only thing I would add to that, and I think it's something that we all forget, whether we're working or, working in advocacy spaces, is, we came here because of a joy, and we shouldn't forget that. And so if we're feeling overwhelmed, or if we've, like I said before, if you need to tag out, just don't forget the joy that brought you to this space. I think, we can all say that getting on a bike for a lot of us is just a moment of catharsis. It calms us down. We feel happy. We all have memories of certain experiences that are ingrained in us as to why it is that we love to cycle, despite the fact that we hate being called cyclists. But, we kind of are in a lot of ways. But remembering that joy is part of staying sane in this space and keeping that drive, because I think we can all forget it sometimes. But it's, with anything, a little reminder of why you're doing what you're doing can help just motivate you to keep going.
I've been trying to say anyone on bikes is like, instead of saying cyclists, I'm like, oh yeah, people on bikes. You were mentioning Vancouver, and it took a while to get going. Once it did get going after the 5 years of, where is it? How did that impact exploratory adventures where people they don't bike often, but hey, you know what? Let's take a bike share and go downtown.
I don't know the specific stats around it, if it's more anecdotal. I know in a lot of cities, that's one thing that they do track, is how many new trips were generated of people that hadn't cycled. I think we knew when New York had launched their city bike, they were getting a lot with people who didn't even own a bike to get out and cycle. And yeah, I don't know the specific numbers on that. I think what was really stark for us, and I realize this is a very larger city context, but we had come to the Netherlands before the bike share launched and seen how bikes and transport link. And then when we got back and there was bike share, and I was literally taking the SkyTrain to a bike share to get to work the rest of the way, it's like, why did this take so long? And, while London may be working more with a bus system, that connection with bike share and transit was huge. And I think it's huge. We know it's huge here, but we are sure it's huge in a lot of other cities as well.
It's huge because it's scalable. And I think we're always talking about, again, the network-based approach, big picture thinking. You can't take bikes on buses up to a point. So if you have that bike share available on the other end of your journey, you're more likely to chain those two modes of travel. But the reason we got so excited about bike share in Vancouver is it's kind of this Trojan horse to utility cycling. And I think in a city where cycling was still seen predominantly for a sport and recreation that required a helmet and special clothing, this idea of getting on an upright bike, a step-through frame, and not wearing a helmet was revolutionary, and it introduced a lot of new people to how normal, slow, everyday cycling could be, especially in a city where bike theft is really high. People were scared of investing in a bike or leaving their bike parked on the street. And the retail market didn't necessarily have these utility bikes. So it was, for all the other reasons to invest in bike share, the cultural shift that I think occurred was quite interesting. And again, cycling to a lot of people who maybe would have walked or take the bus instead, decided to invest a couple of dollars in a monthly bike share membership. It really changed their travel patterns and gave them another choice. If it's a rainy day, maybe they didn't choose that choice. But again, at the end of the day, we're stressing options and freedom of choice rather than the monopoly that the car has in our mobility networks, unfortunately, in most places these days.